Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I wish you all the best and have a nice month. My name is Eleftherios Petropoulos. I am project manager and research associate at Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Greece and Cyprus office. I would like to welcome you to this rather unusual morning session online. Our objective today is to present the Greek version, the Greek translation of the digital manual on investigative journalism of KAS Stiftung, an initiative of the program of media of the Adenauer-Stiftung based in Singapore. And then, based on this presentation, we shall host a discussion with eminent speakers, partners, and friends on the current challenges of journalism. Without further ado, I would like to first give the floor to Mr. Henri Bohnet, Director of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for Greece and Cyprus office. Mr. Bohnet, you have the floor. Thank you.
Kalimera and welcome from Athens. We are very happy to be online again, and I am very happy that finally we get this initiative off the ground and we can present in Greek the Investigative Journalism Manual. It's a very important instrument for us, and I think for many people inside KAS, but hopefully also outside KAS. That's why we are here today to discuss it, because it addresses a challenge journalists all over the world face: how to get to the truth, how to identify facts from fiction, how to find the real motives behind a policy, a campaign, an action a government is taking. Simply put, it's to make government action and other actions more transparent to its citizens the world over. Across the whole world, we face wave after wave of the COVID-19 virus and seemingly endless streams of lockdowns and restrictions on our everyday freedoms. This is something that needs to be investigated and to shine the light on in order to see if everything is justified, where the money goes, what are the motives behind it. And I'm convinced that journalists can usually tell better than politicians, our politicians, where the money goes, where the motives lie, and what is the real facts behind the fiction. We at the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and especially our colleagues from KAS Singapore, have put together an extensive, easy-to-use manual for all journalists who are interested in investigating the truth, and for providing a tool or tools inside this manual in order to work effectively. That's why we're also very happy to have the initiators from Singapore today with us. And also I'm very happy and grateful to our friends and partners from Greece and Brussels who are joining us in the discussion today. Mrs. Schroeder, thank you for tuning in from Brussels. Mr. Xenakis, thank you so much for sharing your experience today. Nikos, Panagiotou, especially heartwarm thanks to you. You have made the initiative to translate this book into Greek, so we are very happy to have that finally come into reality. And of course, my colleague Eleftherios Petropoulos, who organized everything that we sit here today. Thank you very much, and I hope we have a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Henri Bohnet. Let me give the floor to Mr. Graw, who is a director of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Media Program Asia. Mr. Graw, good morning or good evening for you from Athens to Singapore. You have the floor.
Kalimera Elada.
Good morning,
thank you
Greece.
for welcome, and Kalimera, dear Henri Bohnet. Hello, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in Greece. Many greetings from Singapore. It's really satisfying to know that our investigative journalism manual finds your interest. As a director of this media program, and I'm very new to this job only since a couple of weeks, I just want to say a very few words before Lisa will present this tool for investigative journalism to you in detail. But my few remarks, I think investigative journalism is a particularly important form of journalism, but also that one that comes with specific and the greatest risk, and especially in regard to Greece. Earlier this year, there were these death threats against one of your colleagues, Kostas Vaxevanis. And in April, we all have experienced the shocking news about the mafia-style assassination of Georgios Karaivas, Similar cruel incidents took place in other European countries as well, and not to mention Russia. What should be the reaction by the media? To step back from hot and controversial topics like organized crime would be the totally wrong reaction by us, the journalists. The only answer from our side can be to increase our activities and to do it in a way that doesn't only lead to results, but also gives us the best possible protection for our needed service to open societies. In this sense, I take off my not existing hat to all investigative journalists in the world. And it's really a specific pleasure to do this towards Greece, the home of the vowels in the alphabet and the home of Herodotus, who can be called, I think, the first journalist, since he wrote about the war between Greece and Persia in the 5th century BC, mostly as an eyewitness or at least as a contemporary. Bottom line, we owe so much to the rich culture of Greece, so it's good to know from now on that you owe us at least this manual for investigative journalism. Thank you so much. I give the word back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Graw, for this warm greeting from Singapore, from the very far distant Singapore. Now, let us come to the gist of this presentation. And prior to me giving the floor to Mrs. Vlasek to present to us the manual on investigative journalism, I would like to present to you and welcome the three eminent speakers, partners and friends with whom we're going to discuss on investigative journalism and, broadly speaking, on the current challenges of journalism in our era, both in Greece and abroad. With us, we have Mrs. Renate Schroeder from Brussels, Director of the European Federation of Journalists, Mr. Nikos Panagiotou, Associate Professor, School of Journalism and Mass Communications from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, as well as Mr. Dimitris Xenakis, editor of Insidestory.gr, a special and very important platform in Greece. Now, I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Lisa Vlasek, Project Manager of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Media Program Asia, again from Singapore, member of the team that has given birth to this very important manual on investigative journalism to present to us what this is about. And of course, here, let me say that Mrs. Vlasek is going to show to us the English version, the original version. What you're going to see, of course, is available also in Greek. Mrs. Vlasek, you have the floor. And let us, thank you very much for being here.
Right, I think that was my sign. I don't really hear the translation. So I'm going to share my screen and show the website. Give me 1 second, please. All right, hope this is visible. So the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung's Media Program Asia was established in 1996 in the Philippines to promote a free, responsible, and ethical press within the region. Nowadays, we connect leading journalists from all over Asia with colleagues and partners in Germany, as well as other locations in Europe. We organize conferences for aspiring journalists, such as the Asian Conference for Political Communication, ACPC, which will hopefully take place in person in Singapore next year. One focus of our activities is the strengthening of investigative journalism in Asia. The Regional Conference for Investigative Journalists Uncovering Asia emerged from our partnership with the Global Investigative Journalism Network, the GIGN. Thus, we are also proud to present the Investigative Journalism Manual as part of our project. The Investigative Journalism Manual, referred to as IGM, is an online publication in the form of a website, which was established together with the KAS Media Program Southeast Europe and the KAS Media Program Sub-Saharan Africa in 2016. The IGM consists of 8 chapters, which explain the work of an investigative journalist. So I have here the Greek translation, and you can see the different chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Let me maybe just quickly click on one and show you what it looks like. So here you can have different sections of the chapters, all in the translations that are here as well, and just switch between it. Basically, a book style that you can read online. The main objective of the Investigative Journalism Manual is to give journalists the opportunity to educate themselves about investigative journalism techniques through a free and accessible source. We have therefore translated the website into 15 languages, among them now also our newest edition, the translation into Greek. The Investigative Journalism Manual is also available in English, Bengali, Burmese, traditional Mandarin Chinese, Dzongkha, which is the official language of the Kingdom of Bhutan, Bahasa Indonesia, Japanese, Korean, Mongolian, Nepali, Sinhala, Spanish, Tamil, and Vietnamese. The Greek translation was added to the Investigative Journalism Manual to support young professionals in the field who wish to deepen their knowledge and also to create further awareness about investigative journalism in Greece. I would therefore end my presentation. Unless you have any questions, then please feel free to ask them, and hand back to my colleague Eleftherios Petropoulos for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Vlasek, for that. As we said, this manual on investigative journalism of KAS is available on our website and accessible by everyone in Greek as well. Moving on now with a discussion of ours, I would like to welcome and thank for their presence today Mrs. Renate Schroeder, Director of the European Federation of Journalists from Brussels, Mr. Nikos Panagiotou, Associate Professor, School of Journalism and Mass Communications from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and our partner here for the last many years, as well as Mr. Dimitris Xenakis, editor and of the Insidestory.gr platform. And of course, I would like to open the discussion by raising a question for Mr. Nikos Panagiotou. How important is it to have in Greek such a manual, a digital manual on investigative journalism? And being member of the academia in Greece, is there, rather, investigative journalism, does it belong to the curricula of the Greek universities? Thank you.
Mr. Petropoulos, good morning. Good morning to all distinguished guests, to all dear co-panelists, as well as to our audience. And before answering to your question, I would like to ask kindly for a couple of minutes. I don't mean to tire you, of course, but I would like first and foremost to thank Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, Greece, Cyprus, and especially Mr. Henri Bohnet and Mr. Eleftherios Petropoulos for all the support provided to journalistic initiatives we have undertaken in order to promote cutting-edge modern challenges of journalism. From the very beginning of Mr. Bohnet's mandate, and since I first met Mr. Petropoulos, their contribution has been really precious, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them publicly, and I am delighted to be cooperating with them. Now, investigative journalism. What I have repeatedly said to my students is that investigative journalism is not a novelty. What has changed is the intensity and the extent of investigation. In the past, that used to be an individual work, but we have seen through Panama Papers and Pandora and so on and so forth, it calls for teamwork, for synergies, cooperations, another mindset that the European Federation of Journalists has also argued in favor of under the guidance of Mr. Schroeder, an equally precious partner. Now, as to your question about the Greek curricula, as far as the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, we have started to teach investigative journalism related courses since 4 years. Now, in order to be able to translate this manual, we spared no effort, and that is a precious feedback. It is indeed an excellent job done by the Asia section of KAS, and I believe that these initiatives indeed uphold the public debate. What we need to reiterate and to underline is that knowledge is in a continuous flux, is evolving. So this manual and similar initiatives will provide precious insight, and hopefully we will shortly be able to have it printed as well as digital. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Panagiotou. Dear Mr. Xenakis, we could argue that in Greece, there are not as many journalists as there would be. Inside Story is an exception to this rule, for it is a platform, a journalistic platform, a digital one, on a subscription basis. So how Insidestory.gr is working, and after some years of operation, what is the response you have seen from the audience? Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me here. From the very beginning, when we launched the Inside Story initiative, because, you know, one of the main reasons for which we started this venture, this undertaking, is that we identified a major challenge, that is the way in which investigative journalism is confronted with difficulties and challenges as time goes on, and as the general landscape and the general environment, the mass media related environment changes. Now, when we started, and this has not actually changed to date, we were amidst an economic crisis, a financial recession, which heavily affected Greece, of course, and at the same time that there was a political and media crisis, all the difficulties that have to do with divisions, with disagreements, with the way in which politics interacts with society. And when we even see political parties, the way in which they step in and they make their voice heard in society. And at the same time, there was a major problem pertaining to the salaries of journalists. There was a heavy compression, heavy shrinkage of the media, and that crisis affected heavily journalists, and especially those embarked upon the path of time-consuming and costly projects. And so the initial team behind Insidestory.gr would argue that journalism is at risk, especially investigative journalism is at the risk of extinction, which is why we decided to come up with a different paradigm, that is to adopt a different model, a subscription-based model, which has the advantage of giving the certainty to its audience of not relying on external factors, or not being dependent, and this has given us the opportunity also to opt for the topics we wanted to investigate. As time has gone by, we have also understood that now the way to reinforce confidence and trust of people vis-a-vis journalism is to explain to people, to talk to people, to explain to the audience what you do. I mean, the people needs to understand that journalists, as human beings, stick to methodologies able to underpin specific information principles. And that, as we have seen, is indeed a very efficient and effective way to attract new audience, for example. Subscribers, in order to be convinced to pay for the subscription to a medium, and this is important because once you pay some money, you automatically feel a part of it, feel as you belonged to it, to the undertaking. So people, in order for them to pay, they need to have a further insight, a good understanding as to how the medium functions. So that has been helpful to us, and it has also allowed our audience to understand better, to have a better understanding of what investigative journalism and journalism at large stands for. We started with a relatively low number of subscribers, of course. Our members are much lesser than the ones who read a public and open source medium. But thanks to the support of our own members, our own subscribers, we have been able to support journalism, which is very difficult to be supported on the conventional, the traditional media. And so we have been transferring this mindset, this paradigm to the whole media landscape. This is our major model paradigm. And after 5 years of operation, it seems to be resilient enough to be able to endure in a difficult conjuncture, especially in Greece. And what is encouraging is that we are encouraged to carry on. Thank you. Now, starting from your this very last remark as to the business model opted for by Inside Story to create this information and investigative journalism platform, I would like to have your opinion as to the conventional, the more traditional business models of media outlets, and to what an extent they may support this kind of investigative journalism, especially when research needs to go beyond the national frontiers in order to encompass more countries. So you believe that the traditional mass media outlets can support such initiatives? Now, in the past, that was the case. I'm not sure why they don't do it now. Certainly, it has to do with the financial factor, to the economic factor, and also it is a question, it's a matter of mindset and mentality of the country. Traditional media outlets in Greece, for example, have been deteriorating since 20 years. They have not managed to evolve. But, and this does not have to do with Greece alone, but the governance and the government system needs traditional media outlets. They still exist. This is one part, and this has to do with Greece. In Germany, things are slightly different. There is a different tradition, but also a different market. I mean, it's easier to manage similar situations because this is a greater country. As far as your second question is concerned, that is to say the research conducted in more than one country, what is more, in the framework of European Union, this is very, very important because economic and financial activities in the European Union do not limit themselves to one country, to one member state. But here there are major factors, not only cost, we could argue that for a larger organization than Inside Story is, the overhead is not that significant, that substantial. But the way in which this kind of research is conducted, and this is close to my heart, close to my interests. You know, when usually research needs to encompass, needs to be undertaken in more than one country and is financed by a foundation and an institution which may stick to a code of conduct, notwithstanding it is not 100% independent. And so here there is an issue. We need to see how it will evolve. The other day, there was a conference in Brussels on media, if I'm not wrong, and news consortia were announced. And you know, these ventures, these undertakings have a dynamic presence here in Europe, but they have not, we have not seen their position consolidated. So we need to wait and see how it will develop. Now, given that you have talked about the European Media Forum, which indeed took place 2 days ago, I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Schroeder, to Brussels, and ask the same thing. That is, what is your point of view? That is to say, to what an extent they consolidated the traditional models of media outlets may indeed support investigative journalism, according to your experience and, of course, to what is happening at the European level. Mrs. Schroeder, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kalimera. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you also for the study. I guess we'll get back also to the things of safety and investigative journalism later. But asking your question regarding business models and funding for investigative journalism, indeed very important. Unfortunately, such collaborative, cooperative investigative journalism media, on the one hand, are very much in niche situations, like we have Inside Stories. I would like to congratulate Dimitris for having dared to do something like that, subscription level in Greece. I think this is fantastic. And we recently, the EFJ did a study on new business models in journalism, and actually it's been very beautiful to see so many interesting initiatives coming from journalists who are very frustrated with mainstream journalism, with mainstream media, and coming up with different models, but they are all still very precarious. So coming to your question, what about mainstream media in Europe? First of all, I have to say, unfortunately, situation of mainstream media in Europe is getting worse. And I think one reason is there is a market failure in journalism today, not least because most of the advertisement, as you probably all know, guess to whom it goes. I don't think I have to say it. It goes to the big platforms. I mean, in some countries, 80%, in other countries, maybe a bit less. And that, of course, makes it very, very difficult to do investigative journalism. As we all heard, it is very costly. It needs a lot of resources. It needs a lot of funding, and it needs a lot of training for journalists. And not all media can do that. I think nevertheless, we had very important investigative journalism projects in the last years. Nikos mentioned a few. The Panama Papers have been maybe the biggest one, I think, with 400 journalists in I don't know how many countries covering this. And this has only been possible because of this amazing cooperation. The first information came to the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany, and they decided this is much too big for us. And they didn't think of competition. They thought only with a global cooperation, we can make it. And I think they succeeded, and I think it showed again the beauty of cooperation, the beauty of working together at international level, something we all know is not easy. It needs a lot of intercultural dialogue, which is, by the way, something in the training that may or should be added, because living in a global world with global connections, with organized crime at global level, this is very, very important. We have very good translation tools, but what we don't have is translation in our heads. So that is something to be added. Something when we talk about the media scene in general, and I'm sure we'll get back to that, is also public service media. And here, of course, as a German, I can say in Germany, public service media is crucial towards the general landscape in media, and public service media has also contributed to investigative journalism. I mean, be it from the radio or be it from television or now also more online. Of course, we have very different situations in member state countries, but in general, I favor the inclusion of public service media because they have, of course, much more resources. They are working officially in the public interest. So that's very important. At the same time, very unfortunately, in public service media, what we see at the moment is that they are cost cutting, and very often they are cost cutting when it comes to investigative, very interesting political programs, often at prime time. They are being put towards later hours or they are being cut. And that is a big problem. I can just add, when I said we did some studies, there is, for example, there is one very interesting little investigative journalism team, which is called Investigate Europe. And actually there are 9 countries involved, including Greece. And it's paid purely by foundations, very different group of foundations across these 9 countries. And it's cooperating with, I think, 9, 10 different media in those European countries. So I think this is a promising, interesting approach to look at, but it doesn't respond to your question in terms of mass media and input of investigative journalism.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ, κυρία Schroeder, για την απάντησή σας.
Thank you so much, Ms. Schroeder, for this reply. But I would like to stick to you. And let me have a follow-up question about my concern. As mentioned before, investigative journalism is an activity that is quite costly and time-consuming. At the same time, it may put in danger both the professional and the physical survival of journalists. We have seen cases, some cases were mentioned before, besides quite recent ones. You personally, do you share this concern as the head of a European institution, an umbrella for journalists? And how do you think that professional journalism, professional and physical integrity can be protected? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. I think safety has become the main issue. And I have to say, I have worked over 25 years in this federation. And when I started at European level, safety was something for the international level. This unfortunately has changed. And we all know, I assume, that there have been 6 journalists killed within the last years. And I'm really sorry to talk again about Georgios Karavats, who was killed in April. We had Peter de Vries, who was killed this year. So 2 very famous investigative journalists dealing with organized crimes in Greece and in the Netherlands, 2 core European countries, have been brutally killed on the street. I think this is more than a wake-up call. This is really alarm bells ringing. The Council of Europe adopted a recommendation for journalists and media workers in 2016. It has been adopted by all member states. There are great proposals inside, and I'll come to that in a second, But unfortunately, there has not been any or enough political will to implement that. So it's good to have something on paper, but it's not good enough if it's not being respected. We said it, I think Dimitris said it, when we have politicians who are doing smear campaigns against journalists, and it's not only Trump, we see it more and more in the European Union, it's very easy for the citizens to do the same. They have a good example or a very bad example to copy. So the culture of impunity is getting worse. I think the European Union, specifically the European Commission, has recognized these problems as media freedom in Europe is falling. Europe is certainly still the safest place for journalists around, but there have been amazing problems within the last years. That is why the European Commission, as part of their European Democracy Action Plan, came up with a recommendation on safety of journalists, very similar actually to the one by the Council of Europe, and it has just been adopted in September this year. There's a lot of the demands in there actually come from our federation and other journalist federations. We are very happy with very holistic approach to this recommendation. It includes, of course, problems, the need to investigate and prosecute all criminal acts against journalists. As I said before, they are on a rise. We have monitoring both at the Council of Europe level, also at the European Union level, and we see that the cases are on the rise. What the safety recommendation asks for, and I think is very important, is to have them increased in cooperation and dialogue between law enforcement, specifically the police and journalists and journalist association, to understand better each other's role. When do the police have to protect journalists? Where is the access to events? You know that we have, and also specifically in Germany, we have had more and more attacks against journalists doing anti-corona measures, demonstrations. We had attacks against journalists working for public service media in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Germany, which are traditionally PSM trusted institutions. And I think that talks for itself. That shows we really have a paradigm change here. So what we also need is independent rapid response mechanisms, including legal aid for journalists. Very often it's the journalist unions and associations who are providing this legal aid, but in smaller countries where journalist associations do not have so many resources, they don't have any legal aid. We need also psychological support. There is more and more online harassment, specifically against women and minorities, and it often leads to self-censorship. I mean, why should I be harassed, getting at the same time a very weak salary? Why even stay in journalism if there are so many factors working against you? So we need more helplines. We have to give the journalists the feeling that their work is important, that it's respected. I think the Commission has started this exercise rather seriously, but now we need to have it follow at member state level. We need to have access for information, and we need, as Dimitris so rightly said, we need to have social protection schemes for journalists, specifically for freelance journalists who work under often dramatic conditions and are of course also more prone to corruption themselves if they don't get any income from their work. We need a protection against slaps. I don't know if you heard about that. These are strategic lawsuits against journalists in some countries, like in Malta, in Croatia, in Slovenia. These slaps have really increased to an enormous level and also lead to self-censorship of journalists because the media, of course, cannot afford paying so much. So having said that, we have an excellent safety recommendation now at European level, but now it is really up to the member states to implement them, to show that they are taking it seriously, to show that they realize unless we have protection for journalists, we won't have media freedom. We won't have the public's right to know guaranteed. And we all know where this can lead to. When there is no free press anymore, there is no democracy. Hannah Arendt said that many, many years ago, and I think it's applicable still today.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Schroeder. I would like, prior to us continuing with our discussion, I would like to invite us all our viewers, if they have any question or comment, they can write it down on the comments of the live Facebook channel, and this will be conveyed to our interlocutors and to our speakers. Now, moving on, I would like us to touch upon another aspect of this issue, going back, that is, to the part of education, the education of young journalists who want to deal with investigative journalism. And that is why I would like to have the comment by Nikos Panagiotou. To what extent, Mr. Panagiotou, do you think that education may be helpful when it comes to young journalists, and how can they get all necessary tools for investigative journalism? And to the other hand, where do we stand now, both in Greece and in Europe, vis-a-vis the literacy of media? Do you think that the enhancement of literacy in the media may lead to the enhancement of democracy in the society? Well, I will start from the latter, from your final question. I think that it is necessary because these days, the readers, viewers, the audience overall skips a traditional relationship of hierarchy, that is the journalism towards the audience, but this can be a partnership scheme. So the audience needs to have the competence that will allow it to manage the volume of information that it gets. And at the same time, we could highlight the good journalist practice. So when it comes to the dilemma, journalist versus audience, one of the two, or who is the pioneer, we will reply with the following: this relationship should be a partnership relationship, and one should complete the other. A second remark about young journalists and their education. I believe that this is highlighted by the manual as well. A very important part has to do with how we are dealing with witnesses. This is one of the assets of the manual, I think, among others. The fact that it talks about what we have seen to become a gigantic issue, that is the witnesses of public interest and how we're dealing with them. This dimension will help because it will shift the interest from journalists and to their sources and how we can protect sources. So young journalists should be able to train themselves in this type of tactics that enrich and change the notion of investigative journalism, as this is the common ground that we all share from the beginning of this presentation. Thank you. Mrs. Schroeder, would you like to make any comment on that or reply to that? Give us the European vision when it comes to what extent media literacy from the audience may enhance democracy or may protect democracy itself in our society today. Thank you. Of course, in the view of all these challenges that we can see lately. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, also to support Nikos and to say again, this survey, this tool on investigative journalism points already to a few important things we need in training, including digital safety. I was mentioning safety before, but digital safety and how to protect your sources, how to protect your whistleblowers, of course, is very important. The use of graphics is utterly important. I think what's so important today in this ever more polarized way is that we also with complicated, because investigative journalism projects often are very complicated. So how can we simplify the message by using graphics, by using storytelling, by using innovative ways to specifically reach out to other audiences, to reach out to the young people, to reach out also to platforms like TikTok and Instagram. I saw also at this news media forum the other day, again, sorry, I don't want to make publicity for the public service media, but they are quite innovative in finding new ways, audios, videos for Instagram, for TikTok, to explain in a very easy, simple way complicated issues. As we know that disinformation is a bomb, it's spreading, it's viral, it's dangerous, and for us journalists it is indeed a very problem relating to trust. This leads me to your point of media literacy. Indeed, media literacy, digital literacy, information literacy, you name it, is very, very important today. We need to reach out to youngsters, but also to the older generation and explain them what is on social media is not necessarily right, how to verify the accurate journalistic information from users' content, which may not be wrong, huh? Don't get me wrong, but we have to find better ways in terms of media literacy, in terms of showing that it can be very dangerous if you even give a message on WhatsApp, if you give it on and it has not been verified. At the European level, just the last thing at the moment, you know, the European institutions are working very much on the digital DSA, sorry, digital, no, I'm getting, not Safety Act, no, DSA, the Digital Market Act and the digital, I have it true. Anyway, on the regulation of platforms, so they become more transparent, they become more accountable, and many very important issues at stake at the moment being discussed within the European Commission. Some of it very good, some of it also potentially damaging when it comes to media freedom and freedom of expression. So it's always the balance we have to find between both. Digital Service Act, I wanted to say.
Thank you, Mrs. Schroeder. Since you touched upon the issue of social media, we have a question from the audience that is quite important to raise. Apart from the politicians, or apart rather from the political dangers or pressure put upon researchers or investigative journalists, how can we guarantee the job of a journalist vis-a-vis the information disseminated by citizens themselves on social media? For example, one might mention the digital trolls or the internet trolls that are out there. How a journalist can protect his or her own job, or do it in a better way, or following more integrity? Mrs. Schroeder first, and then the others might follow. Mr. Xenakis, perhaps.
Thank you. This is, of course, a very complicated problem. But what I first would like to say, journalism is a free profession, but journalists are bound to ethical standards and journalistic standards. And what we prefer at European level is that we are bound to self-regulation. So that's why we are at the moment having a project on media council in the digital age, where we are trying to get press councils more active when it comes to the online world, and where we try, like also in Greece, to get press councils. Because if we don't have the self-regulation within the journalistic community, it will be very easy that the state starts regulating it. You know the problem in Greece. You just got a law on fake news, which is very dangerous when it comes to freedom of expression, when it comes to media freedom. Who decides what is fake? Who decides what is disinformation? Who decides what is illegal content? because that we also had in Greece when it comes to terrorism content. We have faced that in Europe as well. Some of the national laws, definitions of illegal content are so broad that anything could fall on that. So I'm mixing up a bit, but we are facing different problems. On the one hand, we are facing the problems of regulating journalistic content, be it by the state or be it by the platforms. We don't want the platforms to unilaterally, arbitrarily take down journalistic content. That is not good. But at the same time, we also have freedom of expression. So we also have to see with user content what to do. We have a lot of fact checkers, but this job, of course, is very difficult. So what we keep saying is that journalistic work, media pluralism is the best antidote against disinformation. But of course, it's not enough. We need a holistic approach. The challenge is amazing. So we need civil society, we need researchers, we need a lot of allies to get that working. I'm not sure if I completely responded to your question, but I hope so.
Είναι σίγουρα ένα...
Certainly, that was food for thought. I mean, your answer was food for thought. Mr. Xenakis, to what an extent journalists can safeguard their job and can do their job better in this society where social media prevail? Thank you so much. Renate gave an answer to a multifaceted question, indeed. And Renate rightly pointed out very, very important things. Allow me just to underline once more the risk of platforms. Mrs. Schroeder already touched upon the way in which legislation may indeed change, the way in which journalism may operate and function. And she has talked about the media freedom of expression and media freedom being at stake. In Europe, of course, at least in Europe, there is some kind of regulation. This takes place in a regulated way, which is not the case in platforms. Platforms are, to a great extent, arbitrary, and this is really frightening. I mean, when we have many billion of users of Facebook, in the absence of such a regulation, this is indeed food for concern and raises concern, and we need to see how the power accumulated by platforms may be controlled with a view to not allowing utter arbitrariness, at least as far as European democracies are concerned. And this is something we have seen. Sometimes we have seen that the platforms, voluntarily or not, have indeed affected public opinion. And so this is very important. And this is one part of the story. The other thing is what the journalist may do. I tried to touch upon this at the beginning, and I believe this matters in an anonymous, as it were, environment, in a landscape in which we usually feel as being addressed by machines. In a way, it is important to have a direct contact and interaction with your consumer. I mean, with the person affected, influenced, but what you tell them, and this is something we have been trying to do. And who are you? Of course, I mean, usually we are journalists abiding by specific methodologies, as we said, principles and rules governing their job. On the other hand, there are people who self-declare, self-qualify as journalists, but have no background. And how will the audience actually know? And this is part of the literacy, some other kind of literacy, of course. So readers need to be able to be trained to evaluate sources, to evaluate the sources of information, that is, media, journalists, fellow citizens. For example, amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, many epidemiologists and scholars and scientists, all of them distinguished, talk directly to society, to the public opinion, interestingly. And there are other people arguing they are scholars in order to disseminate conspiracy theories. So it is, I mean, it's important to see how we will manage that. I have not come up with a solution, I have to say, to that problem. Thank you. Now, with reference to this problem, I would like to take a step further and add the time factor. That is to try to focus on this period of time, this conjuncture with the pandemic and so on and so forth. So we have seen the dissemination of fake news. We have seen the voluntary or not disinformation, which bombards Europe, the European member states, Greece, and of course across the globe, and has led to millions of no-vax citizens, thus putting at risk themselves and societies at large. Journalists, especially investigative journalists, have been indeed contributing to shedding light to these conspiracy theories, as they are called. On the other hand, though, the fact that most citizens do not have access to the work, to the job of investigative journalists, they just do not encounter truth. They are not in contact with truth, because as we said, good investigative journalism is costly. And so I would like to ask a question to all three of you. How can we render investigative journalists' job more visible, more accessible, in order to then have that positive multiplier effect when it comes to society and all general public understanding? And I would like to start by you, Mr. Xenakis. Thank you. Now, I would argue that it's easier and more correct, with reference to the specific problem you have touched upon, but at large, when it comes to the dissemination of conspiracy theories at large. You have talked about the anti-vax movement, but there are others, of course. And now, in these cases, it is important, in my view, to try to reach out to those Novaks, to those concerned, to see what are the reasons behind their the rejection, their saying no to vaccination, in order to remedy that. What I mean is that it is important to provide positive arguments in favor of vaccination sometimes, rather than trying to countering to debunking the conspiracy, madness, and mad arguments that some people would rely on, because you may not be able to convince the specific person expressing that, but you may thus provide arguments to their entourage to help them at any point of time to change his mind, delegating their entourage to change his mind rather than you as a medium. What I intend to underline is that we need to have full understanding of this environment. We journalists need to have a better understanding before stepping in. And there are some particular factors that, unless we take on board, we cannot be effective enough. Thank you. And given that we have been talking about dissemination of information and access to information, there's a question for you, Mr. Xenakis, by our audience? Is there any intention whatsoever for you to provide journalistic material to other languages, thus opening up your platform to the non-Greek speakers? Now, thank you for that question. It would be beautiful, although it would entail an increase of cost. But we have indeed, it has occurred to us to go to the European Union, which has been implementing similar projects, to ask some kind of support in order to help similar projects being accessible for other countries, for citizens of other countries. We have a cooperation, for example, with a Romanian medium, just to exchange content, or well, non-contact actually, but to allow readers from one country to keep abreast of what goes on in the other country, of what is the accessible pieces of information in the other country, and vice versa. Mr. Panagiotou, could you also say something about the access of a wider audience to information, to the information provided by journalists, especially investigative journalists, amidst the pandemic, but at large as well?
Well, yes, there are three factors that are crucial. First, training of journalists in new techniques and ways to offer the info in a better way, more understandable by the public. For instance, infographics. If one monitored Panama Papers case or Pandora Papers issue, they would see that this whole volume of information to be able to manage, and Renate alluded to that as well, one should know techniques. One challenge could be how you're going to investigate it and then how you're going to convey it. So when the journalist just shows a volume of information that cannot be followed by the audience or cannot be understood by the audience, because we're talking about specialized issues, for instance, this ruling of this court of fair instance, etc., all this enumeration does not allow to different readers to understand it. A crucial factor would be to train journalists in training in presentation techniques. It should be more simplified, taking into account the timeline of readers and the audience. A second factor to have a more accessible information is to look into investigative journalism as for public good journalism, as I name it. I name it public good interest, which means that thus we can enhance it by institutions, bodies, etc., different entities, and not for that to be characterized in any strange way. In other words, this public good interest journalism is a critical factor in my view. And third point, it is necessary for this logic to be adopted by the owners and by the editors of different media, because qualitative journalism is the one that delivers at the end. That is, and let me here make a reference to something very specific. I would like to apologize from my foreign guests. I am going to mention some Greek examples. We believe in Greece that we are the center of the world. That's why I apologize for that. Now, the Greek TV. In the Greek TV, in the different research shows that are shown on the TV, I'm talking about the Greek TV, you know, as a characteristic example. That is why, says the speaker, there are shows that are loved by the audience, but they don't pay any attention to that. That is investigative journalism, as we've seen in different examples in Germany, in the US, in France, in Britain, delivers these days. It is a factor that may attract the audience. However, this should be made understandable. That is, what is the news conveyed by this type of journalism and how can it be more accessible for the audience? Thank you. Mrs. Schroeder, your own view about it, your European perspective, please, about it. That is, how more audience may get access to the result of the job of investigative journalists. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And first of all, just a personal opinion. I think we are living in such difficult times, not least because of this increased polarization I mentioned before, which is due to different factors beyond journalism. It's due to politicians who have not dealt with a growing group of unprotected people. It's dealing with the globalization, with digitization. People feel they don't take part anymore in democracy. And they think that journalists are part of that. They see journalists too close to government, even though journalists criticize very often the governments, but specifically with the corona crisis, most journalists have been rather close to what the government came out. They have been close to, of course, to evidence, to scientific knowledge and all that. So this is something beyond what we can do as a journalism community. But of course, we have to go through this and think where we can be needed best. And I think this is at local level. I don't think we have the problems in the cities. I think we have the problems at local level, at remote level, where people already feel left out, and where actually journalism, we said it already often, where we face news deserts, where there is hardly any journalism anymore, where we have often community made journalism by local politicians. And unless we find ways for local journalism, I don't think we will manage. Talking about investigative journalism, this of course is today's theme, but I think we cannot concentrate on investigative journalism. All journalists do some sort of investigations, and we have to look at a broad pace here. We also have to see how we can give more training to health journalists, to science journalists, because this has become a theme that has become more important. I listened to quite a few of podcasts just recently where journalists have dialogue with these sort of anti-vax people, and they give everything, they give facts, they talk about it, but there is no dialogue. And this is actually the frustration. It is so difficult to reach out to the other side, because they rely on opinions, they rely on alternative facts, and I have no solution on that. But I just feel from my own experience and listening to these podcasts, and there are quite a lot of attempts to have the dialogue, how difficult that is. But of course, we need that. We need dialogue. We need dialogue with the young. We have said it before. We need graphics. We need to show the evidence which we are now getting through science, because I think this is also a paradox. For the first time, politicians rely on scientific data, which is put together at global pace we have never had before. Of course, it's not all right, but it's in a way quite amazing. And yet we have a growing group of people who do not believe in such scientific data. So there's something wrong in front, and maybe there has to be more discussions about the roots of the problems. Besides, of course, having more funding, having more cooperative models, having more cooperation between public service media, investigative journalism, mainstream media on all platforms. I think what we all said before, I completely agree with, is very important. So some food for thought.
And since you mentioned it, this meeting point of journalists with the opposite side, possibly in the framework of this era, that is of the pandemic, the meeting point between journalists with anti-vaxxers, or with the ones that convey some conspiracy theories. Where exactly is this very delicate line between the presentation of a different voice and the contribution in the dissemination of conspiracy theories, and when it is about the second case, when the media, that is, when journalists are conveying actively fake news or contribute to misinformation. What can we do in these cases? In other words, what is the responsibility of journalists themselves or the media themselves? Mrs. Schroeder, a comment, please. Thank you.
Yes, I think what you say, we face a challenge. There is an increase in toxic language, of course, accelerated by social media, by viral distributions. We see that also in audience engagement. Audience engagement we see, and we still see, as a very, very important point in reaching trust. But the problem with audience engagement is that so many media don't have the resources to do it well, to do content moderation themselves. So again, they leave it to the platforms. And here again, we have a problem. I think, what can we do? We can only continue, and there is a lot of good journalism out there, to be ethical, to do the job you're supposed to do in the public interest. As Nikos says, you have it there, journalism as a public good. It must and should be considered as such. And of course, we also have to fight within our own community, clickbait journalism, and all that journalism that gives money, but doesn't give any trust. So yes, training, 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 funding, 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 media literacy, media literacy, media literacy.
Mr. Panagiotou or Mr. Xenakis, comment perhaps on that? Mr. Panagiotou, go ahead, please. Yes, what I would like to tell you is that we must acknowledge the importance that this type of journalism has and may deliver, starting from the perception that our audience is not a massive audience, but different types of people. This must be a common place amongst journalists. A second point is that the audience nowadays participates, and quite largely it may contribute to a relationship of partnership between journalists. Mr. Xenakis may share with us a very important experiment, Inside Story, about this idea. And third point, I think that it takes more initiatives like the one that is supported right now to enhance journalism overall. That is why I will mention something similar that is taking place for the enhancement of cross-border research programs supported by the Association from Europe. Thank you. Mr. Xenakis, a final comment? Well, I would like to say that it is important, or what Mrs. Schroeder said before, because you said something related to how journalists may convey misinformation. This is something very critical. This is something that goes against our whole effort vis-à-vis trust in the media. But Mrs. Schroeder said something very important as well, related to self-regulation of the media. I believe that this should be further developed because there is a risk in this meeting point of choices. There is a risk, that is the intervention of third parties from the media, like the states or the different platforms or other institutions. I believe that in the next time period, and especially in Greece, that practically have nothing of that. There is no reaction to this type of misinformation by mass media. There must be a more systematic and a more organized activity. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you indeed. I would like to touch upon a final concern following up for what we have discussed up to now. And I will mention an initiative undertaken by the European Union, which was announced lately, during the last days, about the entry into force of a legal text with the general title Media Freedom Act. That is a law on the freedom of media. And it is an initiative of the European Union as a reply to the different phenomena of limiting down the press freedom and pluralism, having in mind the phenomena that exist in countries of Eastern Europe, mainly like Poland, for instance. How could we assess these initiatives? My question goes firstly to Mrs. Schroeder and to the other panelists. If we take into account how member states are evaluated and are assessed in the annual ranking vis-a-vis the freedom of press and the status in their countries, because here we must say that many of member states do not go that well in this ranking. Mrs. Schroeder, a comment, please. Thank you.
Thank you for this important question indeed. Yes, I think it's not the European Union, it's the European Commission. And I think it's important to say, because we don't know what member states will say to this. The European Commission, and foremost its Commissioner on Transparency and Values, Vera Jourova, has pushed for a Media Freedom Act, because the Commission has realized how difficult it is to do with member states who are actually violating the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which includes media freedom and media pluralism, but also the Article 2 with European values as such. And they do not want to use Article 7, which is the so-called time bomb, which would make it possible to expel member states. This is the latest option, and it's not something anybody really thinks would ever happen. So they came up now with the Media Freedom Act, all being aware that it's very difficult to regulate anything regarding media within the European Union, because so far it has been at subsidiarity level. That means media has been seen as a national good. For example, in Germany, it's even more complicated because media is regulated at federal level. And imagine all these federal countries then going to Brussels and saying, no, this is us, this is not you. The Commission now is trying to find a way that makes it possible, that sort of appreciates the internal market regulation, that takes view of existing legislation, that is the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, that is the Copyright Directive, that will also be the Digital Service and Digital Media Act, all dealing with parts of the media. Their intention is foremost to find something on media ownership. I remember 26 years ago when I started in Brussels, we had a green book on media pluralism, which was actually quite good because already at the time there was too much media concentration. But in the end, it failed, specifically at two member states. It was Great Britain and it was Germany, and lobbied by Kirch and Rupert Murdoch, successfully. So this great green paper never came to light. So now the Commission is a bit prudent, but it also realized that something has to be done. So they first would like to have a transparency register, because you know the problems in Hungary, in Poland, in Slovenia, in Romania, in Bulgaria, you name them, are mainly put together under the term media capture. Media capture meaning that media is owned or mainly influenced by either political or economical interests, be they oligarchs, be they politicians in power. I mean, we've had conflict of interest under Italy with Berlusconi before, but this now is a different scale and of course is very, very dangerous. So for that, we would have first media transparency showing who is behind that ownership. Second, they would like to do something regarding the independence of public service media, because also in many countries this independence is in danger. and we still have to see how they find a way to get that. This Media Freedom Act is supposed to come out in the summer next year. The Commission is working at the moment, and we are very much for it, but we are of course also afraid that it's just yet another recommendation or soft law that will not go at the origin of our problems. Having said that, we will do everything to work with the Commission, to work with the European Parliament to make such a Media Freedom Act, to give it some teeth.
Mr. Xenakis, do you have a comment, an observation as to the intention of the European Commission to safeguard and consolidate the legislative framework when it comes to the ownership of media outlets in Europe, on the basis of your experience, of course, as editor of Inside Story? Look, first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that this is a positive step. This is an encouraging step. It sounds well. It sounds very reassuring. Of course, any intervention in press and media needs to be cautious because it can produce either positive or negative results. Mrs. Schroeder has talked about our legislative framework on fake news, and all say that yes, we are in favor of doing something, but then when it's upon you to implement and to apply it, then you see that in practice it is not helpful for media, freedom of expression, etc. And there are other hindrances, as for example, the transposition of European directives that sometimes are transposed in a distorted way. We have a similar case in the VAT, in the case of VAT. So for some reason, only in media, although VAT has a reduced coefficient in other member states, for some reason the Greek government has disregarded this detail in Greece, which is why we pay more taxes than other media, for example, in Greece. So it's also a matter of how legislative measures are implemented, and this is something that European member states suffer from as well, and we need to be cautious of that. So at first sight, I would say it is reassuring, but then we need to see how it will be applied and implemented. Thank you. Now, after the answer given by Mrs. Schroeder, there's a question: is there an institutional cooperation with the European Commission at the level of legislative preliminary decision, preliminary workings, that is, the preliminary drafting of similar acts, of the Media Freedom Act? So to what an extent, in other words, the European Federation of Journalists cooperates with the Commission to that end? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we had internally with other press freedom and civil society groups, we had already discussions what we would like to have in that. And we sent that also to the European Parliament and asked the European Parliament to put pressure on the European Commission. This is the way it goes. And the European Commission at the moment has not officially started it. So it was first supposed to come out in the spring. Now they said July. I have to say they have a lot at the moment to do. And as you know, they don't have so many resources either. So I presume that in the spring, we will talk to them. We will also talk to, for example, the Center for Media Pluralism in Florence, which is doing at a yearly basis a so-called Media Pluralism Monitor. I don't know if you heard about it. I think it's a very important, useful exercise. It includes all 27 member states plus applicant states. And it always comes up with a recommendation at the end. It also asks, Nikos, you may have been consulted as well. They're a media expert in that. And these recommendations can be very useful to be in dialogue then with member states. And media transparency is one issue. So we also in close cooperation with them, like on the safety issue. We want this Media Pluralism Center to do more on safety, because as Dimitris said, unless there is implementation, we can have so many laws, it won't work. for the safety recommendation as well. We want to have a monitoring, and we have to have a sort of sanctions when it's not happening. Then something has to happen. Otherwise, it's another piece of paper. And here we will very closely follow what the Commission will be proposing. I think there will also be a public consultation. I have to see that.
Κύριε Παναγιώτου,
Mr. Panagiotou, your remark, very concisely. Well, unlike other university professors, I am usually very concise. Thank you for that. Now, I would like to say this. These two initiatives are more than important, of course. They are very significant, and I am delighted to hear that. Very rarely indeed we take into account positive initiatives taken by the European Commission. And apart from those mentioned by Renate, I would like to talk to also the struggle to counter the tech giants. And this is very important, and the consumers need to be updated as to the initiatives taken by the European Union to address specific challenges, as this is one. I would like also to underline, to lay the emphasis on the attention given to the protection of research organizations and research initiatives by the European Commission. When it comes to the safety of journalists, we as the laboratory of investigative journalists, together with IMEG and the support of the European Federation of Journalists and other organizations, we have launched an initiative, Safety for Journalists, which is very important. And this is something we need publicly to acknowledge, because there are similar initiatives. People need to be updated on them. Thank you so much. Before giving the floor to all three panelists for some closing remarks, I would like to ask Mrs. Vlasek to again project the website of the Investigative Journalism Manual as a reminder for our audience.
Βλέπουμε εδώ την ιστοσελίδα.
So here you may see the Greek version of the manual, investigativemanual.org. So we may select the Greek version, as I said, the Greek translation, and all the information is generously provided as to how to get prepared to become an investigative journalist. Thank you, Mrs. Vlasek, for having projected this slide. And I would like for a minute to give the floor to our panelists for some closing remarks. Mrs. Schroeder, you're the first to go.
Closing remarks. We had a lot already to talk for. Now let's be positive for some closing remarks. I think there is excellent journalism out there. And I have to say there is a lot of interesting new models. There are many courageous journalists, but also editor and media who are trying to find alternative in a positive way, ways to putting out the message that journalism is a public good, that there is quality, that there are also, thanks to technology, even thanks to artificial intelligence, new ways of doing journalism, better ways of doing journalism. But at the same time, we have to be vigilant. We have to work together. We have to show solidarity to those who are attacked, who are being harassed. We have to be very, very loud. We at the EFJ, with our very small staff, are doing that day by day. We are quite exhausted because it's growing. The attacks against journalists are growing. The murders in Europe are growing. But we are a great community, and together with academics, together with new, interesting, independent media projects, I think we can make it. Thank you, Eleftherios, for this great moderation.
Κυρία Schroeder, ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Mrs. Schroeder, thank you so much. Mr. Xenakis, very concisely, a final remark. Allow me just to congratulate you on this project, the manual, I mean. It is very, very useful indeed for Greece also, because it is something that you can use as a reference material. And certainly we could organize another event or another discussion to study in depth this manual, but certainly it is an opportunity for young people to know how to become an investigative journalist. But you know, this is not nuclear physics, so it is a manual which would also help laymen to understand what are the criteria to be met by a to-be investigative journalist. And so it would help the general audience to get familiar with that. Mr. Panagiotou, well, let us make a call. Let people show trust in journalism. There's very good journalists out there, and journalism is very precious and important for our life, for democracy. We need to restore trust vis-a-vis journalism, and an important step forward to that and is taken by this manual. Thank you for this optimistic note. Now, with your words, we are about to conclude today's online discussion, addressing the discussion on the current challenges of the journalistic profession and the presentation of the Greek version of the KAS manual on investigative journalism. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Graw and Mrs. Vlašek for the cooperation from the Media Program Asia in Singapore. I would like to thank Mrs. Schroeder from Brussels, Mr. Xenakis and Mr. Panagiotou from Thessaloniki. I would like, of course, to thank all of you for having attended our discussion. Hopefully this manual will be helpful for Greek journalists to embark upon the path of investigative journalism, which has only positive services to provide. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.